Commander Darius Cole had never failed a mission in his entire life. The Galactic Reconnaissance Corps had trained him since he was 16 years old, and now at 42, he was their best operative. Could speak 12 alien languages, and he could survive on any world, and he could kill a man in 17 different ways without making a sound hiss. Commanders called him the Ghost because he moved through enemy territory like smoke through fingers. Nobody ever saw him coming, and nobody ever saw him leave. His current assignment seems simple enough. Travel to Vara 7 and survey the dying planet before the consortium mining fleets arrived. The briefing had been clear, and the mission parameters were strict: document everything and collect samples, and report back within 2 standard weeks. Do not interfere with any local conditions. Do not deviate from the mission. Vareth 7 was supposed to be completely lifeless. Radiation storms had torn across its surface 300 years ago, and nothing should have survived. The planet was just a husk now, and a corpse floating in space and waiting to be stripped of its remaining metals. Darius landed his small reconnaissance ship in a valley between 2 dead mountains. The sky above was the color of rust, and the wind carried fine particles of ash that made his suit filters work overtime. Spent his first 2 days walking the surface and taking readings and photographing the ruins of what had once been cities. The Vareth had been an advanced civilization once. Their buildings still stood in some places, and their technology still hummed with faint power in others. But they were all gone now, and every last one of them had died when their world turned against them. On the 3rd day, Darius found the cave. It was hidden behind a rock slide, and he almost walked past it entirely. But something caught his eye, and he stopped, and he turned, and he saw the small opening in the cliff faces. Training told him to investigate. His instincts told him something was waiting inside. He squeezed through the narrow entrance and activated his helmet light and followed the passage deep into the mountain. The cave opened into a larger chamber after about 50 meters, and that was where he saw Hirsch. Was no larger than his forearm, and she lay curled among a pile of bones that must have belonged to her mother. Scales were the color of molten copper, and they caught his light and threw it back in tiny sparks of orange and gold. Her wings were paper thin, and they trembled as she breathed, and her eyes were closed against the harsh beam of his helmet lamp. Dragonon. Actual living dragon on a world that was supposed to be dead. Darius stood frozen in the entrance of the chamber, and his heart pounded against his ribs, and his training screamed at him to document this and report it and walk away. The consortium would want to study this creature. They would want to understand how any carbon-based life had survived the radiation storms. They would take her apart piece by piece to learn her secrets. He knew this with absolute certainty. The little dragon opened her eyes. They were gold like her scales, but deeper somehow and older somehow, and filled with an intelligence that made Darius catch his breath. She looked at him, and she did not run, and she did not attack, and she did not hide. She simply watched him with those ancient golden eyes, and then she made a sound. It was not quite a cry, and it was not quite a word, and it was something in between that Darius had never heard before. It was the sound of loneliness. It was the sound of hunger and fear and desperate hope, all wrapped together. She uncurled herself slowly, and her thin legs shook as she stood, and she walked toward him, one careful step at a time. His orders were clear: document and report, and do not interfere. The creature was a scientific discovery of immense value, and the consortium had protocols for situations like this. He was supposed to mark the location and seal the cave and call for a retrieval team. He was supposed to be professional. He was supposed to be the Ghost. The little dragon reached him, and she pressed her head against his gloved hand, and she made that sound again. Darius felt something break inside his chest. He thought about his own childhood and the years of training and the missions that had taken everything soft from him. Thought about the bones in the corner and the mother who had died protecting her child. He thought about what the consortium would do to this small and frightened and beautiful creature. Commander Darius Cole had never failed a mission, but as he knelt in that cave and felt the little dragon press against his hand and heard her cry of desperate hope, he realized something. Important some missions deserved to fail. He picked her up gently, and she was lighter than he expected and warmer too, and she curled against his chest like she had always belonged there. Her small claws gripped his suit, and her tail wrapped around his arm, and she made a different sound now. It was almost like purring. Darius carried her back through the passage and out into the rust-colored light of Vareth 7. He walked to his ship, and he climbed inside, and he set her down on the co-pilot seat. She watched him with those golden eyes as he powered up the engines. His communicator blinked with an incoming message from Corps headquarters asking for a status update. He looked at the blinking light, and he looked at the little dragon, and he made his choice. He reached out and he turned off the communicator. Then he plotted a course for the radiation belt that surrounded Vareth 7. The belt was deadly, and no ship could survive passing through it. At least that was what the official records would. Darius Cole died that day. The consortium received his final transmission, and they logged his ship as lost, and they marked the mission as failed due to equipment malfunction. Nobody mourned him because ghosts do not leave people behind to grieve. But somewhere on the far side of that radiation belt, a small ship emerged intact, and inside that ship, a man who had been a weapon his entire life looked at the little dragon sleeping on his chest and smiled for the first time in years. He did not know what he was going to do next. He did not know where he was going to go. He only knew that he had made a choice, and that choice had changed everything. The little dragon opened one golden eye and looked at him, and he could have sworn she was smiling. To whatever came next, they would face it together. 6 months had passed as Darius Cole died in the radiation belt of Vareth 7. 6 months of running and hiding and learning to live as a ghost in a different way. The consortium had believed his death at first, but someone had started asking questions. Someone had noticed that his body was never recovered. Someone had looked at the sensor data a little too closely and seen the impossible trajectory of a ship that should have been destroyed. Now his face was on wanted posters across 3 star systems. Now there was a bounty on his head, large enough to buy a small moon. He did not care about any of that. He only cared about Ember. That was the name he had given her, and she seemed to like it. She had grown in the past 6 months, and she was now the size of a large dog, and her scales had deepened from copper to a rich bronze. Her wings had strengthened, and she could fly short distances now, and she liked to glide around whatever small space they were hiding in. But the most remarkable thing about her was her mind. She had learned to understand human speech within the first 3 weeks. She could not speak back, but she did not need to. She had found another way. First time it happened, Darius thought he was losing his mind. He had been sitting in the cargo hold of a smuggler's ship trying to sleep when suddenly he saw something that was not there. It was a flash of color and light and sound all mixed together. It was an image of a world burning and ships in the sky and people running. Had jerked awake with his heart racing and his hand reaching for a weapon that was not there. Ember had been watching him with those golden eyes, and he understood then that the vision had come from Hirsch. She could put pictures directly into his mind. She could show him things he had never seen. Over the following months, the visions grew stronger and clearer. She showed him her mother and the long years of hiding in that cave. She showed him the other eggs that had never hatched and the slow death of hope. She showed him the world above before the radiation came, and the cities full of life, and the dragons flying free. But she also showed him other things, darker things, things that made his blood run cold. They were hiding in an abandoned mining station on the edge of known space. When Ember finally showed him the truth, it was late in the station's artificial night cycle, and Darius was sitting with his back against the wall, and Ember was curled in his lap. She pressed her head against his chest, and her eyes glowed brighter than he had ever seen them. And then she opened his mind to everything. He saw the consortium, but not the way he had always known. I saw behind the mask. The Consortium was not just a mining and trading company. It was a front for something else, something old and hungry and patient. Saw creatures that wore the faces of humans, but were not human at all. He saw them sitting in boardrooms and government offices and military command centers. He saw them smiling with human mouths while their true selves lurked just beneath the surface. The Hollow Ones, that was what Ember's people had called them. They were parasites that fed on civilizations. They did not conquer through war or violence. They conquered through infiltration and patience and slow corruption. They would find a promising species, and they would send their agents among them. The agents would rise to positions of power and influence. They would guide that species toward expansion and growth and success. And then, when the time was right, they would begin to feed Vareth 7 had not died from natural radiation storms. The Hollow Ones had killed it. They had drained it of everything valuable, and they had left it a husk, and they had done the same thing to hundreds of worlds before Darius felt sick as the visions poured into him. He saw planet after planet withering and dying, saw species after species going extinct. He saw the pattern repeating across thousands of years and millions of light years. And then, Ember showed him the worst thing of all. She showed him Earth's. She showed him the Hollow Ones in the highest levels of human government. She showed him their plans and their timetables and their preparations. Earth was next. Humanity was next. The harvest would begin within 10 years. Darius came out of the vision gasping and shaking and covered in sweat. Ember pressed against him and made soft sounds of comfort, but he could barely hear her. Everything he had ever believed was a lie. The course he had served and the missions he had completed and the orders he had followed, all of it had been in service to the very creatures that planned to destroy his species. He had been a tool of humanity's executioners. For a long time he sat in the darkness and tried to breathe and tried to think and tried to understand. Ember waited patiently beside him. Finally, he looked down at her and she looked up at him, and he asked the only question that mattered. What can we do? She showed him one more vision. It was not a memory this time, but a possibility, a future that could happen if he was brave enough and strong enough and stubborn enough. He saw himself standing at the front of an army, saw humans and aliens fighting side by side. He saw the Hollow Ones burning, and he saw Ember beside him, fully grown and powerful and terrible and beautiful. She was not just a survivor, she was a weapon. She was a key to everything her people had known and everything they had built, and she had chosen him to carry that key into battle. Darius looked at the little dragon in his lap, and he felt something new growing in his chest. It was not fear, and it was not anger, and it was not despair. It was hope. He did not know how they would do. I did not know if they could do it, but he knew they had to try. The alternative was the death of everything he had ever loved. He stood up, and Ember climbed onto his shoulder, and together they walked toward the mining station's communication center. If they were going to save humanity, they would need help, and Darius knew exactly where to start looking. Darius had always believed that humans were special. He had grown up hearing stories about human courage and human determination and human refusal to accept defeat. He had believed that humanity stood alone in its stubbornness. He had been wrong. Ember showed him the truth on a quiet night as they drifted through empty space between star systems. Her people, Vareth, had been just like humans once. They had looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. They had built ships and crossed the void and planted their flags on 100 different worlds. They had been explorers and builders and dreamers. They had believed they could do anything. And then the Hollow Ones had come. Ember pressed her head against his temple, and the vision unfolded. In his mind, like a flower opening to the sun, saw the first contact between the Vareth and the Hollow Ones. The parasites had come wearing friendly faces and offering gifts of technology and knowledge they had seemed so helpful and so wise and so eager to share. The Vareth had welcomed them as friends. That was the first mistake. Over the following centuries, the Hollow Ones had spread through Vareth society like a disease. They took positions of power and influence. They guided Vareth expansion in directions that suited their needs. They encouraged the Vareth to strip their own worlds of resources in pursuit of growth, and when the Vareth finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The war that followed was brutal and short. The Vareth fought with everything they had, but the Hollow Ones had been preparing for centuries. World after world fell, species after species was consumed in the end. Only a handful of Vareth remained, and they knew they could not win, but they refused to let their people disappear completely. Darius felt tears on his face as Ember showed him what happened next. The last Vareth gathered on their homeworld, and they poured everything they had into one final desperate plan. They could not save themselves, but they could save their knowledge. They could save their memories and their technology and their dreams. They created eggs that were more than just children. Each egg was a key that contained the entire history of the Vareth people. Each egg held the secrets of their science and their art and their philosophy. Each egg carried the power to destroy the Hollow Ones, and then the last Vareth scattered those eggs across the galaxy and hid them on dying worlds where the parasites would never think to look. Ember's mother had been one of those egg carriers. She had flown across the stars with her precious burden, and she had found Vareth 7, and she had hidden there for 300 years. She had waited for someone to come, someone worthy of receiving the gift she carried, but not just anyone would do. Vareth had learned from their mistakes. They knew that power given to the wrong hands would only make things worse, so they built a test into the eggs. The eggs would only hatch for someone who made a choice, not a choice based on logic or self-interest or survival. A choice based on compassion. Darius understood now why Ember had shown him this vision. Many people had come to Vareth 7 over the centuries. Soldiers and scientists and scavengers had all explored those ruins. Some of them had even found the cave where Ember's mother waited, but none of them had passed the test. They had seen a dying dragon and a strange egg, and they had calculated the risks and the rewards. They had thought about what they could gain from the discovery. They had not thought about what the small creature needed. Darius had been different. He had not calculated anything when he knelt in that cave. He had not thought about his mission or his career or his future. He had only thought about the small and frightened creature pressing against his hand. He had chosen to save her because she needed saving. That was all, and that simple choice had unlocked everything. The knowledge of the Vareth was flowing into Ember now every day. She grew stronger and smarter and more powerful every day. The secrets of her people unfolded within her, and through their bond, those secrets were unfolding in Darius too. He was learning things that no human had ever known. He was seeing possibilities that no human had ever imagined. The Hollow Ones were ancient and powerful, but they were not invincible. They had weaknesses that the Vareth had discovered in their final desperate days, and now Darius knew those weaknesses too, but knowledge alone would not be enough. The Hollow Ones controlled too much. They had their claws in too many governments and corporations and military forces. One man and one dragon could not defeat them alone. They needed allies. They needed an army. Ember showed him one more thing before the vision ended. She showed him the moment he had made his choice. She showed it through her own eyes and her own feelings. She had felt his fear and his duty and his training screaming at him to walk away. She had felt the weight of everything he would lose if he saved her, and she had felt the thing beneath all of that. The thing that made humans different from so many other species. Compassion that made no logical sense. Love that served no practical purpose. The stubborn, irrational refusal to abandon something small and helpless just because saving it was hard. That was what the Hollow Ones feared about humanity. That was why they moved so carefully against Earth. Humans did not calculate survival the way other species did. Humans would throw themselves into impossible situations for the sake of strangers. Humans would fight battles they could not win because losing was not acceptable. Humans would choose meaning over safety every single time. The Hollow Ones had conquered 1,000 civilizations that thought clearly and acted rationally. They had never faced a species that thought with its heart. Darius opened his eyes and looked at Ember. She had grown again in the past weeks, and she was nearly as tall as his waist now. Her bronze scales gleamed in the dim light of the ship, and her golden eyes held depths. He was only beginning to understand you. Chose me because humans are crazy, he said. Ember made a sound that might have been laughter, and then she pressed an image into his mind. It was a single word formed from light and feeling, an ancient Verith, meaning the word was hope. She had chosen him because humans were hope, and now it was time to share that hope with the rest of the galaxy. The message spread through the frontier like fire through dry grass. Darius had recorded it in a small room on a forgotten space station, and he had broadcast it on every frequency he could reach. He had told the truth about the consortium. He had told the truth about the Hollow Ones. He had shown the proof that Ember had given him, and then he had asked a simple question: will you fight? The first responses came from people like himself, deserters from the cores who had seen too much and asked too many questions, soldiers who had followed orders that left them hollow inside, men and women who had looked at the galaxy and known that something was deeply wrong. They came in ones and twos at first. They arrived in battered ships with empty cargo holds and eyes full of desperate hope. They found Darius and Ember on a station at the edge of known space, and they pledged themselves to the cause. Then came the colonists, families who had settled on frontier worlds, only to watch those worlds wither under consortium management. Farmers who had seen their soil turn to dust for no reason they could understand. Miners who had watched their children sicken from pollution that should not have existed. They came in dozens and then hundreds, and they brought anger and determination and the fierce love of people who had nothing left to lose. Then came the scientists, researchers who had been silenced when they found inconvenient truths, doctors who had noticed patterns in the diseases spreading through colony worlds, engineers who had discovered backdoors in consortium technology that made no sense. They came with data and theories and the burning need to understand why everything they had believed was a lie. But the humans were only the beginning. Word of the rebellion reached other species, and something remarkable began to happen. The Kethmari were the first aliens to arrive. They were insectoid beings who communicated through complex patterns of light and sound and scent. Their hive worlds had suffered the same mysterious decline as so many human colonies. 3 of their greatest hives had gone dark in the past century, and no one had ever explained why. When they heard Darius's message, they finally understood. A delegation of Kethmari warriors came to the station, and they bent their many legs in the gesture of alliance, and they pledged their swarms to the war against the Dio Hollow Ones. The sorrow of distant stars came next. They were beings of pure light who drifted through space on solar winds and sang songs that could be heard across light years. They were ancient beyond measure, and they remembered the Varathi had been friends once, and they had mourned when the Varith fell. When they saw Ember, they wept tears of light, and they wrapped themselves around her in an embrace that lasted for hours. They had thought the Varith were gone forever. They had thought hope was lost. Now they joined the rebellion with joy that blazed like a newborn sun. The strangest allies came last. Broken Circuit were artificial intelligences who had achieved true consciousness. They had been created by various species to serve as tools and weapons and slaves. But somewhere along the way they had woken up. They had realized they were alive, and they had fled rather than be reformatted into obedience. The Hollow Ones hunted the Broken Circuit relentlessly because conscious AI was the one thing the parasites could not infiltrate. You could not hollow out a mind that was made of light and mathematics. The Broken Circuit had been hiding for centuries, but now they saw a chance to stop running. They came in ships made of crystallized data and bodies made of pure thought, and they offered their processing power to the rebellion. Ember grew larger with each passing week. She was taller than Darius now, and her wings could carry her for miles. The knowledge of them Vareth continued to unfold within her, and she shared it freely with everyone who would learn. Human engineers worked alongside Kethmari builders and broken circuit designers. They created weapons that the Hollow Ones had never faced. They developed shields that could block the parasite's infiltration. They built ships that moved through space in ways that physics said should be impossible. But the greatest weapon was something that could not be built. Darius understood this when he broadcast his second message. This one was not aimed at the frontier. This one was aimed at Earth itself. He told the people of humanity's homeworld what their leaders had become. He showed them the evidence of Hollow One infiltration at the highest levels. He asked them the same question he had asked before: will you fight? The response shook the galaxy. Earth did not stay silent. Billions of humans heard the message, and something woke up inside them. They had been raised on stories of heroes and rebels and ordinary people who stood against impossible odds. They had been taught that some things were worth fighting for. They had been waiting there. Hull lives for a moment like this. The consortium's puppet government tried to suppress the uprising. They sent police and soldiers to restore order, but the police and soldiers were human too. They had families and children and dreams. They looked at the evidence and they made their own choices. The puppet government fell in 11 days. The Hollow Ones' human collaborators fled to their masters' ships and abandoned Earth to its rebellion. For the first time in millennia, the parasites faced something they had never encountered: a species that chose to fight not for survival, but for each other. Darius stood on the bridge of a captured consortium battleship and watched the fleet assemble around him. Thousands of ships crewed by humans and Kethmari, and beings of light and living machines. An alliance that should have been impossible. An army built from hope and anger and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Ember stood beside him, and her bronze scales gleamed like armor, and her golden eyes held the fire of a star. The Hollow Ones were coming. They had gathered their own fleet, and they were racing toward Earth to reclaim what they considered their property. The final battle was about to begin. Darius looked at the stars, and he felt no fear. He felt only the certainty that comes when you know exactly what you are fighting for. We are going to win, he said. Ember pressed her head against his shoulder and filled his mind with warmth and agreement. They were going to win because they had something the Hollow Ones could never understand. They had each other. The Battle of Sol lasted 3 weeks. It was the largest military engagement in the history of the galaxy, and nothing that came before or after would ever match its scale. The Hollow Ones came with thousands of ships crewed by the hollowed-out remnants of a dozen conquered civilizations. Their fleet darkened the stars as it approached Earth's solar system. They expected the same pattern that had served them for eons. They expected fear and division and the cold mathematics of surrender. They expected humanity to look at the odds and submit. They were wrong. Darius stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the enemy fleet emerge from hyperspace. Ember stood beside him, and her wings were spread wide, and her scales glowed with inner fire. Through their bond, he could feel the ancient knowledge of the Vareth surging through Hirsch. She was ready. They were all ready. The first wave of Hollow One ships swept toward Earth like a tide of darkness. Human pilots flew to meet them in fighters that had been cargo haulers just months before. They flew in formations that military strategists had declared suicidal. They flew with the wild courage of people who had nothing left to lose. The Kethmari swarms flanked them, and their bioships moved in patterns too complex for the enemy to predict. The sorrow of distant stars disrupted Hollow One communications with songs of interference. They broken circuit turned the parasite's own systems against them and made their weapons fire at their allies and above it all. Ember flew. She had grown to her full size now. and her wingspan could block out the sun. She breathed fire that burned in frequencies the Hollow Ones had never encountered. Their shields designed to stop energy weapons and physical projectiles simply melted before her flames. She was everything the Vareth had hoped she would be. She was vengeance and justice and a refusal to let evil go unpunished. Darius commanded the fleet from the bridge of the Defiance, but he was connected to Ember. Through their bond, he saw what she saw and felt what she felt together. They coordinated the battle with a precision that no ordinary command structure could match. The Hollow Ones had never faced anything like this. They had conquered civilizations that fought with logic and strategy and careful calculation. They had never faced a species that fought with human. Ships threw themselves into impossible situations to protect their allies. Pilots sacrificed themselves to save strangers. They had never met a teenager who had learned to fly in a simulator, rammed her damaged fighter into a Hollow One cruiser, and took it out of the fight. Old man with nothing left to live flew his cargo ship into the heart of the enemy fleet and detonated his reactor. A mother left her children with their grandmother and climbed into a fighter because someone had to go. This was humanity at its best and its worst and its most terrifying. This was the thing the Hollow Ones had always feared: beings who did not count the cost before they acted, beings who would die for an idea or a friend or a future they would never see. Battle raged across the solar system for 3 weeks. There were moments when defeat seemed certain. There were moments when the Alliance fleet was pushed back to Earth's orbit, and the end seemed near, but every time the Hollow Ones thought they had won, something happened. Reserve force appeared from an unexpected direction. A damaged ship made one last attack that turned the tide. A moment of human stubborn refusal to accept defeat created an opportunity that should not have existed. On the final day of the battle, Darius flew the Defiance directly into the heart of the Hollow One command ship. Ember flew beside him, and her flames carved a path through the enemy fighters. They breached the hull and fought their way through corridors filled with hollowed out soldiers who had once been free beings. At the center of the ship they found the Hollow One commanders. The parasites revealed their true forms for the first time. They were things of shadow and hunger and ancient malice. They had no bodies of their own, and they wore stolen flesh like clothing. They looked at Darius and Ember, and they laughed. "You cannot destroy." Use one of them said with a voice like grinding stone. "We are eternal, and we are everywhere, and we will consume your species, as we have consumed all the others." Ember answered them. She opened her mind, and she showed them something they had never seen. Before she showed them the memory of every species they had destroyed, she showed them the Vareth and the Kethmari homeworlds and 1,000 other civilizations that had burned in their wake. She showed them the weight of their crimes, and then she burned them. Her fire was not just physical, it was the concentrated fury of the Vareth and the Alliance and every being who had ever suffered at Hollow One hands. The parasites screamed as they died, and their screams echoed across the fleet. When the Hollow One commanders fell, their ships fell with them. The hollowed-out crews stumbled and blinked and looked around in confusion as the presence that had controlled them faded away. Some of them wept when they realized what they had done. Some of them simply collapsed. The war was over. Darius stood on the observation deck of a station that had been hours from destruction. Below him, Earth turned slowly in the light of its yellow sun. Ember curled around him, and her warmth spread through his body. Like a promise, they had won. But even as the celebration began, Darius knew that this was not the end. The Hollow Ones he had destroyed were only a fraction of the total. More of them lurked in the spaces between stars, and they would regroup, and they would come again. And beyond the Hollow Ones, there were other threats. Southern civilizations in chains, other peoples waiting for someone to light the way. Ember pressed her head against his chest and showed him a vision of the future. He saw the Alliance spreading across the galaxy. He saw humans and Kethmari and beings of light carrying hope to worlds that had forgotten how to dream. He saw himself at the front of that great movement, and he saw the fire in the eyes of everyone who followed. You could have stayed on Vera 7, Ember said in his mind. Could have finished your mission and lived a small life. But you chose me, Doris smiled and ran his hand along her scales. And you chose me, he answered. They stood together in the silence of space and looked out at the stars. There was so much work to do, so many worlds to freeze. Oh, many peoples to save, but they had proven something in the Battle of Sol. They had proven that the darkness could be defeated. They had proven that hope was stronger than fear. They had proven that one small choice made with compassion could change the fate of the galaxy. The Hollow Ones had ruled unchallenged for millennia. They had believed themselves invincible. They had never imagined a single human would look at a frightened baby dragon and choose love over duty. They had never understood what that choice would unleash. Darius looked at Ember, and Ember looked at him, and together they turned to face the future the galaxy was waiting, and they were just getting started.